Well, in addition to honoring the rules and values related to truth-telling and informed consent, another significant responsibility of healthcare professionals is to honor patient confidentiality. Confidentiality is closely related to the concept of privacy, and we want to begin reflecting on that concept. However, as the article in the Stanford Dictionary of Philosophy notes, privacy is notoriously hard to define. The article says that despite its historic prominence, the use of the term is not uniform, and there remains confusion over the meaning, value, and scope of the concept of privacy, unquote. Well, recognizing that difficulty and the ambiguity of the way the term has been used across the years, it does seem to me that there are some significant things we can say about what privacy is and why we value it. Let's look at those. The first thing we can say with confidence is that privacy has to do with limited or limiting access to oneself. It invariably involves a matter of control. One has privacy when one has control over access to oneself. Now, a significant aspect of what one has control over, and particularly as it relates to the healthcare context, is control over information about oneself. Consider this quotation from an earlier version of our textbook. A person enjoys privacy when other individuals do not, without permission, invade what may be called his or her sphere of privacy, a realm of intimate or sensitive information about the person that he or she generally does not wish to share with others or wishes to share with only a small circle of persons. Notice here the emphasis on information, though this sphere of privacy would seem to have larger implications. So consider some of these implications. One is experiencing or enjoying privacy when one can avoid or prevent being seen or heard. One is experiencing privacy when one can exclude others from touching you, or even keep them out of the space near you, your private space, so to speak. Maybe the most expansive concept of privacy, and one that really leaks over into that area of general personal autonomy, is the claim made in the Roe versus Wade abortion decision, which refers to a right of privacy as meaning protection from interference in making decisions about particularly personal matters, like whether or not to have an abortion. Now, let me offer these observations with respect to this definition of privacy that I have offered so far. First, and I think we've already made this point, is that privacy obviously requires some personal or individual power or control. It's not simply that other people don't have access to us, it's that we have the power to keep people from having access to us, or we have control over the access they have to us. The second thing I would say, and you may have noticed this as we were going along, is that there's a highly subjective component to privacy. What is sensitive information? What are those matters about which we want to make sure others don't know? When is it that we want to not be heard or seen? We might say, what are the boundaries then between what is private and what is public? And the final comment I would make is that different cultures, and maybe even different subcultures within our single culture, define the private sphere quite differently. What may seem private to us may not seem to be private to others. I think we might also say that our own conceptions of what's private and what's not changes depending upon the context in which we are working or acting. All that to say that while we certainly can offer some kind of a definition of privacy, it's a very slippery and difficult concept, isn't it? Now, having some concept of what privacy is, noting the difficulty of the concept, we now are in a position to ask why we value it, why it's something that matters to us. The first thing I think that can be said here is that the value we place on privacy has to do with our sense of the value of each individual, the value of the individuality of each human being, the uniqueness of each person, and the sense of individual human identity and dignity that matters to us. It surely relates to the value we place on our capacity for autonomy. Without privacy, we would have little sense of ourselves, it seems to me, as self-determining. If we had no control over access to ourselves, information about ourselves, if we had no control over who can see us and hear us and touch us, we would hardly have a sense of ourselves as something valuable that can govern our own lives, as autonomy says we can and should. You should notice in the Stanford Dictionary article about privacy reference to the work of one Blaustein, who associates the value of privacy with what he calls inviolate personality as the social value protected by privacy. This inviolate personality defines one's essence as a human being, says Blaustein, and it includes individual dignity and integrity, personal autonomy and independence. Respect for these values, he says, is what grounds and unifies the concept of privacy. The common conceptual thread linking diverse privacy cases prohibiting dissemination of confidential information, eavesdropping, surveillance, and wiretapping, to name a few, is the value of protection against injury to individual freedom and human dignity. Invasion of privacy is best understood in some as an affront to human dignity. Very interesting claim that points to the fundamental significance that we attach to enjoying privacy, to being able to control access to ourselves, because it's so fundamentally related to who we are as individuals, to our dignity as persons, and we will see to our ability to act autonomously. Some commentators have noted the relationship between privacy and intimacy. We have spoken before about our social nature, about how many of us find or all of us find our greatest joy in our relationships with other persons, particularly our intimate relationships. Some would have suggested that without privacy, without an ability to control access to ourselves, it would be impossible to form intimate relationships. If everyone had the same access to us, how could we distinguish our friends and our lovers, those who are closest to us, from an ordinary person? Charles Fried refers to this, and it's quoted in the Stanford Dictionary article. He says, "Privacy has intrinsic value and is necessarily related to and fundamental for one's development as an individual with a moral and social personality able to form intimate relationships involving respect, love, friendship, and trust." Privacy is valuable because it allows one control over information about oneself, which allows one to maintain varying degrees of intimacy. Indeed, love, friendship, and trust are only possible if persons enjoy privacy and accord it to each other. Privacy allows one the freedom to define one's relations with others and to define oneself. In this way, privacy is also closely connected with respect and self-respect. Let me suggest one final reason that we value privacy, and that has to do with its relationship to our sense of personal security, given our physical vulnerability, which we've talked about in relation to the principle of non-maleficence. Might it not be maintained that without control over access to ourselves, we could never feel secure? We could never feel as if we were protected from harm and injury, that we would never feel that our vulnerability was respected without control over access to ourselves. Let me conclude this discussion of why we value privacy with this very interesting quote by one Ian Thompson, a philosopher from the University of Edinburgh. He says, on logical grounds, if we concede the existence of individual human rights of any kind, then it's almost tautologically self-evident that there must be a, quote, right to privacy, unquote. For without it, there would be no private individuals to have or exercise those rights. That the individual should be spiritually inviolate in the sense of being protected from invasion, violation, and abuse of his privacy would seem to be the necessary presupposition of his possession of any of the other individual human rights claimed for him. For example, the right to freedom of speech, freedom of movement and association, freedom of worship, etc. So, it would seem that privacy is something we value because we value the individual and because we believe that individuals have rights. It should be obvious now what we've said from the beginning, and that is there's a close relationship between privacy and confidentiality. A significant aspect of what privacy requires that we have control over is access to information about ourselves. And confidentiality refers to the responsibility of professionals and others to respect our control over that information. Consider this quotation in the Brand Ballard article in our textbook. While privacy involves others not entering a person's sphere of privacy without permission, confidentiality involves those who have legitimate access to private information not bringing it out of that sphere and sharing it without permission. You may have noticed the place of confidentiality in the various codes of ethics we've looked at. For example, the Hippocratic Oath, that ancient code of medical ethics says, whatsoever I shall see or hear in the course of my profession, as well as outside of my profession in my intercourse with men, if it be what should not be published abroad, I will never divulge, holding such things to be holy secrets. In a more contemporary language, the AMA Code of Ethics for Physicians says, the information disclosed to a physician by a patient should be held in confidence. And the Nursing Code, the nurse has a duty to maintain confidentiality of all patient information. Or consider the PT Code for physical therapists. They shall protect confidential patient-client information and may disclose confidential information to appropriate authorities only when required by law. Physician's assistants shall uphold the doctrine of confidentiality regarding privileged patient information unless required to release such information by law or since such information becomes necessary to protect the welfare of the patient or the community. The music therapist protects the confidentiality of information obtained in the course of practice, supervision, teaching, and or research. So throughout the codes, we see this idea that a fundamental legitimate expectation that patients and clients have of healthcare professionals is the maintaining of confidentiality. It may well be obvious to you, but that doesn't mean it's not important to point out that the therapeutic relationship that healthcare professionals have with their patients, a relationship aimed at promoting patient welfare, necessarily involves granting healthcare professionals unusual access to patients. Healthcare professionals must have physical contact with patients. They touch us. They must see our bodies. Sometimes parts of our bodies we show to almost no one else. Healthcare professionals must gather and record personal information about our identity, our history, our family relationships. And the other thing to point out here is that this relationship between the professional and the patient or the client that requires this unusual access is one that involves an imbalance of power. The healthcare professional is in a position of power in relation to the patient. And so the patient experiences in that relationship their vulnerability, in part because the relationship requires allowing this professional, this person we do not know well or intimately, into our zones or spheres of privacy. As we think about the moral foundation or basis for our commitment to respecting patient confidentiality, it's important to think about three principles in which those rules related to confidentiality are grounded. The first and most obvious one is autonomy. Given the close relationship between privacy and confidentiality, and between privacy and individuality and self-determination that we've spoken of, protecting confidentiality is a way of showing respect for patient autonomy. If that were not enough, it's clear that patients have a legitimate expectation that we respect the confidentiality of the information they disclose to us because it's in our codes of ethics, because it's in the law as a part of society's defining of precisely what we legitimately expect of healthcare professionals. But maybe most important of all is how essential protection of confidentiality is to the therapeutic relationship and to the benefit that we expect patients to derive from that relationship. The point is this: unless patients can be absolutely confident that the private matters they disclose to us will be kept confidential, we will not be able to develop with them the relationship of trust and mutual dependence that is necessary if this relationship is truly to be beneficial medically to them. Autonomy, fidelity, and beneficence. Erickson and Miller, in an article called Caring for Patients While Respecting Their Privacy, say it this way: the patient's well-being could be jeopardized and the fundamental trust between patient and nurse destroyed by unnecessary access to data or by the inappropriate disclosure of identifiable patient information. The rights, well-being, and safety of the individual patient should be the primary factors in arriving at any professional judgment concerning the disposition of confidential information received from or about the patient, whether oral or written or electronic. The standard of nursing practice and the nurse's responsibility to provide quality care require that relevant data be shared with those members of the healthcare team who have a need to know. Only information pertinent to a patient's treatment and welfare is disclosed, and only to those directly involved with the patient's care. On the next page, they write, establishing and maintaining patients' trust in their caregivers is critical to obtaining a complete history, an accurate health record, and carrying out an effective treatment plan. If a nurse fails to protect the patient's privacy, the erosion in the relationship can have dire consequences to the nurse-patient relationship. As we conclude this presentation, take a careful look at this advice from Erickson and Miller in reference to the obligation of healthcare professionals to maintain patient confidentiality.